Sometimes, the greatest battle isn't fought on a battlefield, but on an empty roadside where you're forced to prove you deserve respect. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She simply stood her ground, and that was enough to change everything. Winston, North Carolina. It was a dark Wednesday night, the clock ticking just past 11. The city had fallen asleep, blanketed in dim amber streetlights and the quiet hum of insects, a melancholic soundtrack for unresolved thoughts. Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant, 47, had just left a late meeting at Fort Mason, more than 2 hours' drive from home. She sat behind the wheel of a black government-issued SUV. No special plates, no unnecessary flair. Simple, clean, silent, much like the woman herself. She had served over 20 years in the military, led humanitarian missions, commanded logistics for emergency operations, and completed 2 tours in the Middle East. But tonight, all she wanted was to get home. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't swerved. There was no reason to be pulled over. And yet, red and blue lights flared in her rearview mirror, sharp as blades slicing through the calm. She exhaled, pulled to the curb, eyes calm but her jaw slightly clenched. Her instincts told her this wouldn't be simple. A tall man stepped out of the patrol car, mid-40s perhaps. His voice was dry and clipped, carrying across the distance before he even reached her window. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. Celeste kept both hands on the steering wheel, just as she'd been trained since her earliest days in uniform. She slowly rolled the window down. "Officer, may I ask the reason I'm being stopped?" A flashlight beam hit her square in the face. "You were swerving. Vehicle was moving erratically. Possible influence of a substance." She wasn't surprised. Her brow arched slightly. "I haven't been drinking. I just left a meeting at Fort Mason. This is a government vehicle." Brian Calloway glanced over her documents, narrowing his eyes at the line that read, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army. His lip curled into a bitter smirk. "That doesn't mean you're above the law." Celeste didn't flinch. "I've never assumed that, officer. Step out of the vehicle. I'm administering a field sobriety test." At that moment, Celeste leaned slightly and tapped record on her phone, already resting in the center console. "For transparency, I'm recording this interaction." In an instant, Calloway's eyes flickered, then snapped back into the same icy stare. "You're obstructing a law enforcement officer." Celeste opened the door slowly, stepping out with the upright posture of someone who had stared down combat zones. But to Brian Calloway, she was just a black woman daring to ask questions. And that, in his eyes, was already a problem. On the quiet shoulder of Forest Hill Avenue, the night wind bit with a chill, but it wasn't nearly as cold as the demeanor of the officer standing opposite her. Celeste Grant stood motionless, arms relaxed at her sides, unwavering. She didn't need to say another word. Everything was being recorded by the small phone tucked discreetly in the side pocket of her coat. Brian Calloway, 44, wore a face seasoned with smug confidence after nearly 17 years on the force. He paid no real attention to the military ID peeking from her wallet, or perhaps he did see it and simply didn't care. To him, police authority was the highest order, and in all his years patrolling this stretch of road, no one had dared push back. Walk a straight line on the painted stripe. Eyes forward. No stumbling, no touching the curb. Got it? His voice was curt, almost rehearsed, hand hovering near the holster at his hip. Celeste nodded once, then began to move. Her military boots met the pavement with steady, deliberate thuds. One step, then another. Firm, precise, unshaken. But to Calloway, it didn't matter. He scribbled something in his citation book, the tip of his pen tapping rhythmically against the hood of his cruiser. "You drifted lanes? Suspicious driving behavior. Even if you passed the test just now, I'm still within my rights to issue a citation." Celeste's voice remained calm. "I understand. I'll be responding through formal legal channels." Calloway scoffed, holding out the ticket like he was granting her a favor. "Be my guest. Not the first time someone's threatened to sue. But on this road, I make the calls. You get that?" She accepted the paper without flinching. She'd seen this brand of hollow authority before, abroad in war zones, in men who ruled by fear. And now, here was again, right on American soil. Calloway turned away with a dismissive wave, like shooing a pest. Drive safe. And next time, try not to give people a reason to be suspicious. His cruiser growled to life, backed up, and peeled off, leaving behind a trail of exhaust and a heavy silence that clung to the roadside. Back in her vehicle, Celeste sat still for several minutes, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Her gaze fixed ahead, but her mind drifted back to dozens of conversations she'd had with young soldiers, especially soldiers of color. She'd always told them, stay calm, live long enough to prove them wrong through your actions. And now she realized she was the one who needed that reminder. 3 days later, Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant sat in her office at Fort Mason. The desk lamp cast a soft glow over documents spread neatly before her. Her uniform was crisp, the nameplate polished, but her expression was taut, her eyes no longer carrying their usual calm. Instead, they burned with the quiet fury of someone who had endured injustice far too often, and this time refused to let it slide. She unlocked her phone and rewound the video captured from her car's dashcam, paired with audio from the microphone she'd clipped on that night. Officer Calloway's voice rang out, harsh, commanding. With no clear justification for demanding she exit the vehicle. This is the evidence, Celeste murmured. It's no longer my word against his. This is the truth. Just then, her young assistant, Sergeant Lane, knocked and stepped in, carrying a slim folder. Ma'am, I spoke with the base legal office. They said if you want to move forward formally, they're ready to support you. But are you sure? Celeste looked up, steady. Lane, she said, you know I led teams across the Middle East while bombs were falling, right? I've kept calm in front of armed enemies. But what shook me that night wasn't violence. It was being dismissed, as if I was invisible. She signed the complaint form, clipped the video file and her detailed incident report inside the folder. Every step methodical. No anger, no retaliation, just responsibility for all the others who might face the same treatment with no voice to fight back. The documents were submitted that same afternoon. Both the military justice system and the Winston Police Department received simultaneous notices. In her formal filing, Celeste explicitly stated that Officer Calloway's behavior violated her civil rights, severely undermined her personal dignity, and contradicted the standards expected from any public officer. That night, inside a quiet conference room at Fort Mason, a group of her colleagues, both military and civilian, gathered discreetly, not to plan a mission, not to discuss logistics, but to watch the footage. The room was silent, tense, focused, and when the video ended, someone simply said, "This is why we need her at the front lines." Celeste didn't seek applause, but she knew the truth needs to be spoken in the right way, at the right time. And this time, she was ready to take on the system. And she wasn't alone. Monday morning, the Winston Police Department still sat in hushed calm when Brian Calloway walked into the administrative wing. His coffee cup still steamed, but his face was colder than the winter air outside. He was used to nods of respect from colleagues, used to the steady chorus of "Morning, Sarge." But today, silence. On his desk sat a thick manila envelope. No name on the outside, just the red seal of the North Carolina State Court. He tore it open. His palm began to sweat as the blade sliced through the edge. Inside, a subpoena, violation of civil rights, abuse of authority, unlawful intimidation of a federal citizen. His forehead twitched. He gripped the document like he might tear it apart, but his eyes flicked sideways. A few officers had stopped typing. Heads lifted. No one said anything, but it was clear. They all knew. Later that morning, during the internal staff briefing, Chief Sam Delaney rapped his knuckles against the table. His voice was cold and flat. "I don't need to remind you we're under external investigation. Anyone involved will answer to federal oversight. No exceptions." Calloway sat frozen. Beside him, Officer Alvarez, a young patrolman who once idolized him, quietly gathered his notepad and looked away. But what truly ignited public outrage was when an anonymous witness, someone who had filmed the incident from across the street that night, sent the footage to a local news station. In the previously unreleased video, there was a moment where Calloway shouted at Celeste, "Don't think that wearing a uniform gives you more power than me. Out here, I am the law." That line became the epicenter of a media storm when WXCL-TV aired the clip on its 6 p.m. broadcast. Within hours, the video was being shared at lightning speed across social media. Accompanied by the hashtag I'm not above the law, a direct inversion of the word Celeste had calmly spoken to Calloway that night. Just hours later, the sheriff's office received over 300 emails of protest, alongside a petition signed by more than 40,000 people, calling for Calloway's immediate suspension. Inside City Hall, Mayor Thomas L. Granger convened an emergency meeting with the city's legal advisory board. "This is no longer an internal disciplinary matter," he said, voice tense. "This is a full-blown public crisis, a reputational crisis for the entire city." Meanwhile, at Fort Mason, Celeste received quiet messages from some of the young soldiers she had once mentored. "Ma'am, we saw the video. Thank you for not staying silent." She didn't reply. She simply smiled just slightly, because Celeste Grant knew this fight was far from over. But at least now, the light was shining on the right place. In the following week, Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant continued her duties at Fort Mason, maintaining her usual composure. But behind the scenes, she was preparing for one of the most important battles of her life. She made no media appearances. She posted nothing on social media. She stayed quiet and focused on building a watertight legal case. Inside her office, she sat with her civil rights attorney, Michelle Carter, a woman known for her relentless courtroom presence. Together, they rewatched the footage of that night. Michelle leaned forward and said plainly, "This is a textbook case of abuse of power." Celeste nodded slowly, her eyes firm. "I'm not doing this for myself." She thought of the young soldiers she had trained, the ones she wanted to protect from injustice, not just in war zones, but here at home. Because if I don't speak up, she asked herself silently, then who will? Back at the Winston Police Department, Brian Calloway could feel the walls closing in. His once casual banter in the break room had turned to awkward silences. Co-workers avoided his gaze. Conversations halted the moment he entered a room. He knew they were all talking. Whispers, stares, judgment. The court date was approaching fast. Both sides were preparing for a high-stakes showdown. But this wasn't just Celeste versus Calloway anymore. It had become a clash of principles. Celeste stood not just for herself, but for every voice ever silenced under the weight of a badge. She was determined to prove no one is above the law, and silence is not the only option. The story continues, with rising tension, emotional weight, and two people on opposite sides of justice, heading straight for a courtroom, where truth will be exposed and accountability demanded. Morning of the trial, North Carolina State Courthouse. The atmosphere inside the courthouse felt like lead pressing down on everyone's chest. Outside, the media were scattered along the courthouse steps, cameras poised. But it was inside, in that tense, silent courtroom, where the real pressure hung in the air. The public gallery was packed, not just with reporters and curious citizens, but with off-duty soldiers from Fort Mason, where Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant served. When Celeste entered, dressed in full military uniform, the medals on her chest gleaming under the courtroom lights, the room fell utterly still. She didn't need an introduction. With her firm steps and steady gaze, she commanded silence and demanded respect. At the defendant's table sat Officer Brian Calloway, beside his attorney. Gone was the cocky swagger of late-night patrols, replaced by a shaky mixture of arrogance and anxiety that couldn't hold itself together. Michelle Carter, a renowned civil rights attorney and Celeste counsel, opened simply, "We'll let the truth speak for itself." The first piece of evidence was the video from Celeste's phone. The audio was so clear, you could hear the light wind outside the window of her car. Her calm voice asking why she was pulled over. The repeated demands from Calloway for a sobriety test, without any explanation. The footage ended with Celeste stepping out of the vehicle, her composed presence contrasting sharply with Calloway's curt tone and flashlight shining harshly into her face. Then came a second video, This one from Calloway's own body cam. He had failed to disclose it during the investigation, but the court had demanded its release. In that footage, the jury saw it all. His sideways glances dripping with judgment, his hand hovering near his weapon, in a tone of voice meant to intimidate, not to uphold the law. The courtroom sat frozen. No one questioned now why Celeste had chosen to pursue legal action. And when the prosecutor asked, "Officer Calloway, at that moment, did you know who she was?" Calloway dropped his gaze, voice barely audible. "No." One juror, a former U.S. Marine, nodded faintly. He didn't need to speak. His eyes said it all. They understood that not everyone in uniform is treated with respect, and not everyone who wears a badge wields it with honor. Celeste didn't need to say a word. The footage, unedited, undeniable, made it clear. She wasn't stopped for any legal reason. She was stopped because of a bias, plain and simple. For the first time since that night, Celeste exhaled, not in triumph, but in quiet relief that at last the truth was seen. Meanwhile, Calloway sat upright, but his hands had been clenched tight ever since the video ended. Beads of sweat formed on his temple, soaking into the collar of his uniform shirt. His attorney, Douglas Whitman, sighed and gave the judge a subtle nod. "Your Honor, we're ready to begin testimony." Calloway rose, his movements stiff. He had worn his patrol cap to court, but it was gone now. His damp hair clung to his forehead. The prosecutor began, sharp and measured. "Officer Calloway, do you recall the night of January 17th? Calloway swallowed hard. Yes, I remember. Do you have a justifiable reason for stopping Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant's vehicle?" "I thought her car was swerving slightly." "You thought, or you saw clearly?" "I thought so." A small wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The jurors' eyes bore down on Calloway like sharpened blades, piercing and unflinching. The prosecutor didn't let the moment slip. "Did you know she was a high-ranking officer in the military?" Calloway paused for just a few seconds, but in that silence, the truth already began to show. "No." "Would you have acted differently if you had known?" The question, simple, yet sharp like a scalpel, cut clean through any pretense. Calloway exhaled hard through his nose and looked down. "Maybe." A gasp broke through the back of the room. A few people sat upright, stunned. An older woman whispered, "He just admitted it." The prosecutor immediately pounced. "So, to clarify, you're saying that if you had known her status, you might have acted differently?" Calloway stammered. "I didn't. You said maybe, didn't you?" Calloway lowered his head. "Yes, that was it. The turning point. Every defense of procedure, of reasonable suspicion, of doing his job collapsed in one breath. What motivated Calloway's behavior wasn't evidence. It was bias, and he had just confessed it with his own mouth. From the gallery, a young man wearing a military insignia stood up, unable to contain himself. That's the real problem. They only respect status, not people. The judge slammed the gavel sharply. "Order in the court." But the words had already rung out like a bell, impossible to unhear. Celeste sat still, unmoving, but her eyes burned with a bright intensity. It wasn't triumph. It was pain, that all too familiar pain of being underestimated, dismissed, until a title, a uniform, or a rank forced someone to look again. As Calloway stepped down from the witness stand, he kept his eyes low. He didn't look at anyone, but every gaze in the room asked the same silent question. "So, if I wasn't in uniform, if I wasn't someone, would you have treated me the same?" After the morning session, the legal teams spilled out into the courthouse hallway. The media was already waiting. Microphones and cameras formed a semicircle. A CBS reporter shoved a mic toward Michelle Carter, Celeste's attorney. "What's your take on Calloway's testimony?" Michelle didn't hesitate. "Today, the court didn't just witness abuse of authority. We saw something more dangerous. A mindset where respect is reserved only for those with status. That's not justice. That's hierarchy." Back inside the courthouse, Celeste hadn't left yet. She stood silently for a moment, then walked over to Michelle and spoke quietly. "Tomorrow, we bring the data. I want them to see how many others have gone through what I did." But they didn't have a camera. They didn't have a uniform. They didn't have a chance. She didn't say it out of vengeance. She said it as a reminder. This fight isn't over. As the courtroom prepared for day 3 of the trial, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. Every seat filled, eyes locked on Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant and Officer Brian Calloway, two figures who now represented more than just a traffic stop. And from the bench, Judge Margot Lewis looked down upon the court, her expression sober, her voice steady as she turned to the jury. After reviewing all evidence, including video footage and testimony from both the plaintiff and the defendant, this court finds in favor of Lieutenant Colonel Grant. A silent wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Celeste didn't cry. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She simply exhaled, a long, quiet breath, her gaze lifting toward the ceiling, as if offering a silent tribute to every woman who had been sidelined by silence. Officer Brian Calloway is found to have violated civil rights and abused his authority in the execution of his duties, Judge Lewis continued. He is hereby ordered to pay $35,000 in damages to the plaintiff. Furthermore, this ruling will be forwarded to the Department of Justice and the Winston Police Department for a policy review concerning traffic stops and abuse of authority. Toward the back of the courtroom, a group of soldiers in uniform nodded in agreement. In the front row, Attorney Michelle Carter rested a hand on Celeste's shoulder. "We're not asking for a revolution," she said softly. "We're asking for respect." And Calloway? He remained motionless, shoulders hunched, eyes locked on the floor. When he finally stood, his gaze avoided everyone, even the colleagues who once viewed him as the embodiment of iron discipline. But that iron had corroded, weakened by arrogance and a lack of control. Outside the courthouse, a reporter shouted, "Lieutenant Colonel Grant, any statement?" Celeste paused on the courthouse steps. She turned, sunlight catching the polished metals on her uniform. "It's not because I'm a high-ranking officer that I deserve to be treated differently," she said. "It's because I'm a human being, and I refuse to be treated as less than one just because the other person wears a badge." The crowd stood still, breath held, before a slow, swelling round of applause filled the air. Not applause for a courtroom victory, but for the clarity she brought, the reminder of what true strength is. Not in shouting, not in power, but in standing firm, silently, if necessary. As she turned and walked away, Celeste felt it clearly. This victory wasn't hers alone. It was a message to everyone who had ever been mistreated on a quiet roadside in the middle of the night. Dignity doesn't need to scream to be real. A week after the trial, Fort Mason returned to its usual rhythm. New recruits stood in formation under the morning sun, boots gleaming, back straight, eyes fixed on their commanding officers. But none of them expected to see the woman who had just forced an entire system to reckon with itself. Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant stepped onto the training hall platform in full uniform. Her medals gleamed, not as a boast, but as silent proof of the battle she'd survived on foreign soil and in her own country. "What do you think makes someone worthy of wearing a rank?" she asked. Her voice was calm, low, but it carried through the silence. A few hands rose cautiously. "Discipline, strength, loyalty." Celeste nodded. "Right, but there's something more, something I need you to ingrain deeper than all of that. Responsibility." She walked slowly through the aisles. "I'm not here to talk about winning a case. I'm standing here for those who never got the chance to speak. For those who were insulted, ignored, oppressed because they wore no rank, had no camera, and were never heard." She paused, her expression calm, unwavering. "Power is not for domination," she said. "It's a burden, meant to serve justice. If you don't understand that, then that badge on your chest is nothing more than a hollow ornament." Silence settled over the room. No more scribbling pens, just eyes fixed on the woman who had chosen calm over anger, action over silence. And that alone made her unforgettable. Later that afternoon, as training concluded and the room began to clear, a young recruit walked hesitantly toward Lieutenant Colonel Celeste Grant. He stood at attention, awkward but determined. "Ma'am, if that had been me that night, I probably would have yelled." Celeste looked at him, the wisdom of experience glowing in her eyes. And that would have made you lose, even if you were right. She walked over to the last row of empty seats, where the late sunlight streamed gently through the window panes. There, she sat, no longer a commanding officer in that moment, but a teacher offering a lesson not found in any manual. They will provoke you, belittle you, try to make you feel small, invisible. But you don't have to yell to be heard. You don't need to rage to be respected. She placed her hand over her chest. Real strength lies in holding your integrity, even when no one stands beside you. The young soldier nodded. He didn't say a word, but it was clear he had absorbed every one of hers. Celeste rose, adjusted her cap, and made her way toward the exit. But just before stepping out, she turned back and left them with one final truth. Power isn't in forcing others into silence. It's knowing when to speak up for something worth fighting for. There was no applause, no stirring speech, but in the eyes of every young soldier in that room, something had shifted. And on that quiet day at Fort Mason, they learned a truth that would stay with them far beyond the battlefield. To stand firm for what is right, sometimes, is the bravest act a person in uniform can make.